Hi, this is Dan, and welcome to another episode of Backward Engineering Your Script. Today we are going to be talking about Act 2, which is the most difficult part of any screenplay to write. And most of the time, it's very difficult because this is the longest part of the script. Unlike the first act, which is usually around 30 pages, and the last act, which is usually around 30 pages, this act is 60 pages. Since the time I went to film school and the present, there have been many changes in emphasis that have made the actual process of screenwriting a lot easier. For example, there have been many new things that formerly were not talked about too much, but were given greater emphasis in the recent past. And this includes the incorporation of a concept known as a key scene. And the key scene usually comes directly in the middle of the screenplay. And you can look at the screenplay, therefore, as everything leading up to that key scene as being rising action, and everything that comes after it being a consequence of that rising action. And that, in many ways, allows the second act to be broken into two parts. And that does, in fact, make it a little easier if you think, perhaps only to yourself, that maybe the second act is actually two acts at once. But because of nomenclature being fairly set in place, we'll still call it by the traditional names. But even then, the second act always creates an opportunity to have writer's block. And the reason for that is because so many of the scenes in the second act are more about advancing the story, more about giving a pathway for the plot to make sense. And in the process of doing all of that, you have scenes that are building towards something rather than actually delivering it. And in this kind of delayed gratification, which, as Meryl Streep says in the immortal Postcards from the Edge, instant gratification takes too damn long. In the process of getting there, you often find yourself working on scenes that are bread and butter, and they're not necessarily inspirational. And because they are not inspirational, it's very easy to get waylaid. Well, later on in today's lecture, we're going to actually talk about ways to make those scenes their own little gems. But let's actually start with going over certain ways that if you're coming up with a script, that maybe the second act can be handled a little bit differently. And I'm going to give some advice, and I'm also going to use a little bit of contrarian advice by one of my friends, Cameron Pasha, who is a writer and has had many shows produced. So he comes at it from that perspective, whereas I come at it from the development perspective of wanting to get something done. And under Cameron's method, what he does is he suggests that you begin with Act 1. And then once you have figured out Act 1, the beginning of your story, where it begins, what your setup is, then you write your ending. And then once you've written your ending and you have your beginning, and I'm not talking about the scenes, I'm just talking about basic story points, then you have two goals. You have a beginning and an end, and obviously there's a midpoint between them where the character is going to have their big epiphany. And so Cameron feels from that point, you can come up with your key scene. Now, my method from a development person's standpoint is the exact opposite of that. The way I suggest doing it is to start with your ending and write your ending scenes first. And often you're not even sure of what kind of story you're going to write. Now, I got this from the writers that I worked with, particularly the ones I worked with early in my career. So I picked up a lot of information from them that might actually be kind of bad advice in certain instances because it's anecdotal. Nonetheless, when I was forced to write a screenplay after years of saying I'm not a good writer for my master's degree, I found out that following their advice actually helped me do it. So the trick for starting with the ending, and this is from my first two bosses, who were Paul Monette and Alfred Sole. Now, Paul Monette became kind of a big figure in the gay community during the time of AIDS, because he wrote a book called Borrowed Time, which was all about his boyfriend's ultimate death from HTLV-3. And then he wrote a book called Becoming a Man, which won the National Book Award. In between writing those very august books, he also wrote novelizations for movies such as Predator and Nosferatu and Scarface. These used to be paperback originals that were often based on the screenplays of the movies and were done as a tie-in before the movie was released. In addition to that, he and Alfred were always writing feature films, which most of the time they knew were going to be part of what was going to be released as a TV movie, often for stars that they happen to know in their social lives. So, for example, while I was working for them, they worked very heavily on a screenplay entitled Draw Me a Picture, which was to star Elizabeth Montgomery and a then 15 or 16-year-old Drew Barrymore. And so I got to see their process in action. Now, the way they handled Draw Me a Picture was they started out with the end scene, which is where the mother, who is a developmentally disabled woman, has just successfully completed a courtroom trial where she is going to be allowed to maintain custody of her daughter. So they wrote that scene. They wrote the big reunion scene, which everyone you knew was going to be reduced to tears, and it was going to work. And then they wrote the decision in the courtroom and how that came about, and the suspense of waiting for the jury to come in with a verdict of what would happen. Then they came up with the scene before that. And as they were writing it, all of a sudden one day Paul said, I know the first scene. And then they went and they wrote the first scene of the script, and they wrote the scene that followed that. And in the middle of that, Alfred, who was always very good at coming up with visuals, came up with some great scene that happens in a playground. And so they wrote that, even though that was going to be in the middle. Now, what did they do at that point? Now they had a bunch of scenes at the end. They had a bunch of scenes at the beginning. Now, these are fully written scenes. And what they would do is they would print them out. And I was typing this all for them. They were dictating and I was typing. And they would print them out. And then Paul would put the printouts on the floor in his attic, where the scene would roughly fall in a completed script. And so gradually you would fill in these gaps on the floor. And that process worked really well for him, unless, of course, his obnoxious dog Puck got away and ran upstairs and messed everything up. And he did that more than once. But, we were able to figure it out, thank God. Anyway, what they would do then is they would write the treatment. Yes, they were actually writing whole scenes before they wrote the treatment. Why would they do this? This was because this is the way they worked. And one of the important things that I'd like you to remember is that when you are writing, however you write is going to be up to you. There is no right or wrong way to write. Now, when you're in school or when you're writing to somebody's dictates, this all goes out the window, because you then are probably going to be given certain deadlines, and you're probably going to be given deadlines not in Kapkahi manner, but probably in scene order or character order. So it's going to be different once you get paid or once you have a grade hanging over you. But the reason I'm suggesting to try this method, to at least try with either doing the Cameron method, first scene, last scene, then think about the middle, or the Paul and Alfred method, which was last scene and block of last scenes, early scenes and then work on various scenes throughout the middle, not necessarily in order. So there is no right or wrong way. If you have a deadline staring at you, you might have to make adjustments to all of this. So let's talk now about the other problem that the second act has. Usually the second act comes after a very big turning point moment. I think when we talked about Wizard of Oz, I said, well, first of all, Wizard of Oz has a kind of a different structure. It's more play oriented. But with Wizard of Oz, Dorothy decides to go on her journey, whether it's to walk outside of her house once they've arrived in Oz, or whether or not it's when she goes on the journey to look for the Emerald City. By the way, that is about 20 pages between those two spots. So you can see where there's a challenge there. But think about Star Wars. What is the first act break in Star Wars? The first act break is when Luke goes back to his house and discovers that his parents have been murdered and that he no longer has a home. He's got to go on this journey. And he and Obi-Wan go off to find how they can help Princess Leia. What is the key scene in Star Wars? The key scene in Star Wars, again, you can debate it a little bit, but by and large, I believe that the key scene in Star Wars comes when Luke is reunited with the princess or meets her in person for the first time. And she's a little bit sassy with him. And he says, I have come to rescue you. This is a major moment for him because up until this point, he has still been a follower. He has still been at the mercy of his mentors, whether it be Obi-Wan, whether it be Han Solo, whom he's trying to win over without realizing that he's already won him over, that the guy's already impressed with him, and he's seeing in him an ability to redeem himself, all this other stuff. And so from there, we have the falling action. Now, I've sometimes moved where that key scene is to them just arriving on the Death Star, and before they get up with Princess Leia. But again, this is debatable. This is semantics. It's not important because either way, those scenes are very close to each other. So the second plot point comes after Obi-Wan is killed by Darth Vader, and Luke realizes that he's going to have to destroy the Death Star on his own, that it's going to be up to him to make this all happen. That's a big turning point as well when all is lost. If we look at Wizard of Oz, what's the key scene? The key scene is them arriving at the Emerald City. Why? Because up to that point, Dorothy's been meeting her other friends. She's been moving forward in her journey to Oz, where supposedly things are going to happen. But what's the consequence of arriving at Oz? The consequence of arriving at Oz is that things aren't necessarily peachy keen, that the wizard first won't see them. And then when they finally get the chance to see the wizard, rather than being benevolent, he's downright scary. And worse than that, he does give them some hope that he will give them what they desire. But in order to get that, they have to bring him the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West, which means they have to kill her, which means Dorothy's once again going to have to put on her mass murderous hat and kill another person. So this is a moment where all is lost. And so that's where the lion jumps out of the window, and we assume that that's the beginning of the third act. Again, Wizard of Oz has a different construction from what we would consider common today. So therefore, it also has a second plot point, different plot point, and that is after the Wicked Witch of the West is melted, And then Dorothy and her friends are going to go back to the Emerald City and find out what happened. That's another potential area for the second plot point to happen. Now, this is not conventional at all anymore. But if you look at a lot of old movies, you will notice they have a different structure from what we're used to today. And often the second plot point, the big turn that leads to the finale, is a different place. What it actually is the dilemma that everyone has been fighting against for the bulk of the script is solved. And now, just like at the key scene where the journey meets an important point and then we have the consequences of it, now we have the consequences for the big problem with the story being solved. Now let's take a look at some examples of that. Again, most of these are going to be older movies. Look at Gone with the Wind. What is the second plot point? The second plot point, I argue, is when Scarlett agrees to marry Rhett. Now, normally that would be the end of the movie because, hey, he's been chasing her for the past nearly 3 hours, and now she's finally consented to marry him. And shouldn't that be the time the glorious music rises and we have our fade out? But no, in Gone with the Wind, the last act, which is, by the way, the scrappiest part of the movie, is all about Scarlett and Rhett's marriage falling apart for the most soap opera-like antics that could only work in a 1930s type setup. But it's the consequence of the solution. In The Wizard of Oz, getting rid of the Wicked Witch actually solves the problem of Oz, other than the fact that Dorothy misses her aunt and uncle, and maybe even the hired hands. Oz is actually a pretty nice place now. There's no more witches to menace Dorothy. And yeah, the wizard turns out to be a phony, which kind of sucks. But then again, she has these 3 guys. Yeah, they're very close to the people that she's on the farm with. But they all like her and are much more supportive of her than the people in Kansas were. Plus, with the Wicked Witch gone, Dorothy doesn't have to worry about Toto. But if she goes back to Kansas, Miss Gulch is still waiting to take Toto to the sheriff and have him destroyed, right? So why would she want to go back to Kansas when there's an existential threat against her dog, as opposed to saying, let's try to bring Uncle Henry and Aunt Em here, and then you can leave the farm to the 3 idiots, right? They could have done that. So that solved the problem of Oz. Didn't solve the propaganda problem, which was Hollywood didn't want people coming from the hinterlands to Hollywood anymore to become Black Dahlia victims or become prostitutes or whatever else was happening that was nefarious in Hollywood at that time. Now let's discuss some of the problems with dealing with the second act trouble, that every scene in it is usually a lot more expository than many writers are comfortable with. Many writers live on the nuance that occurs in every scene they write, and they love these little nuances. But when you don't have that little nuance, your scene feels somehow incomplete. Well, there's a number of ways to quote unquote get over yourself, because the important thing is to finish the script and make a perfect draft later. Please drop perfectionist energy. Howard Hawks, one of the great directors of the golden age of Hollywood, used to be kind of cantankerous, but he would come up with statements that were actually very smart. And one of his great statements was him saying, a great movie has 5 great scenes, 4 to 5. I never remember the exact quote. 4 to 5 great scenes and no bad ones. Words are important. 4 to 5 great scenes and no bad ones. Note he didn't say no expository scenes. Note he didn't say no scenes that just kind of move the plot forward and don't do much else. Note he didn't say scenes that you might need to put in with filler because heaven forbid your movie's too short. Not a problem these days, but it used to be kind of a problem sometimes where movies would come in too short, especially when you were dealing with TV movies and they had to be a certain number of minutes or Europe wouldn't take them. So what did Hawks define as a bad scene? Because this is important too. A bad scene is defined as a scene that undermines the rest. This is a serious issue, not to have a scene that compromises the values that the rest of your script has built up. Everything else is acceptable. Now, what are some tricks in order to get past a scene that you just hate? The first thing that you can do is consider the people in the scene. For example, if you have actors who have a lot of charisma and have a little bit of a spark between themselves, you can play up on that. Certainly, when Cleopatra was made in 1963 and Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's adulterous romance was all the talk and all the scandal and definitely getting people really excited to see this movie, they put up with the second half of Cleopatra being really kind of bad, as Darryl F. Zanuck, on taking over 20th Century Fox again, because Cleopatra was such a runaway train, said, "The guy's a weakling. I can't stand weaklings." Didn't matter. It was Liz and Dick at the height of their romance and all that. So that made that movie, had it not been for the out of control budget, the top movie of 1963 and one of the top movies of 1964. It was that big of a hit. It just cost too much. Remember, it was almost $800 million in today's dollars as a budget, with no home video, no streaming, no basic cable, no extended cable. Yeah, so that was a lot of money. Anyway, other things that you could do outside of playing off who your characters are is play off just the dynamics of the scenes. In East of Eden, there's two scenes where this is very clear. They're fairly bread and butter relationship scenes between James Dean and Julie Harris. One of them takes place in a daisy field, and that daisy field provides a lot of interest and visual interest that makes the scene make more sense. Then there's another scene where she and James Dean are stuck on a Ferris wheel, and during that scene, she confesses she loves him, and he confesses he loves her. They're in a public place. They know that any second the Ferris wheel can start up again, so they're in danger of being discovered. But that location makes that scene memorable. The other thing you can do is you can play around with observers watching a scene. Alfred Hitchcock was an expert at this. In how many movies did he play around with who's in the scene? And often you would have a negligible character, a bit player on the sidelines watching the scene. In When Harry Met Sally, there's the infamous scene where Meg Ryan shows Billy Crystal how she could fake an orgasm while she's having a dessert. And while that scene is funny in and of itself, the button on it is when there's a woman, an older lady, who's watching them and sees Meg Ryan's reaction and says, "I'll have what the lady is having," meaning the dessert, because she assumed that. So see how you can play with that element. Another trick that you can play is, let's say that you have a character who is about to enter a scene that's going to have what is perhaps a not great result. And you see them sitting there thinking about it and thinking about it and worrying about it and worrying about it. And then you go to the scene and you play the scene out. Well, sometimes what you can do is put the words of that character into the other person's mouth. Let's say that you're doing a scene where a couple's going to break up. So let's make it the guy who thinks he's going to break up. So he spends the scene worried about what's going to happen when he announces that he thinks they should break up. Instead, now we're at the scene, and before he can speak, the girl he's with says, "Wait a minute, I think we should break up. Let's not waste any more time on this." So now you've undermined the audience's expectation. You've gotten the same message across. And maybe even you have the guy in suspense because now he doesn't want to break up anymore. See, you can play with it that way. The final way, and there's always more than this, but these are just samples that I would suggest you look at, is ellipse the whole scene. If we all know kind of what the scene is about and what could happen in it, maybe we don't need the scene. Maybe we can begin it with the person leaving in order to have the scene happen, and then they come back and we see by their expression what did happen. So the consequences have been there. These are some of the tricks that can help you get through that second act, that big block in the center of your script. Remember, please don't have perfectionist energy. Write what you love first. If you're on a deadline, it's a little bit different, but not really, because you have time to actually prep and think about things. Next time we do backward engineering your script, we'll talk about the third act, your resolution, and also examples of storytelling that don't fall into three-part dramatic structure at all.
I see Howard Beale as a latter-day prophet, a magnificent messianic figure inveighing against the hypocrisies of our times, a strip Savonarola Monday through Friday that, I tell you, Frank, could just go through the roof.